Thank you, Mark, for the introduction. Thank you, everyone, for coming. And thank you also for the invitation. So can everyone hear me? Is the technical aspects okay? So when I looked at the abstract for the seminar, I thought there's a number of themes around combining qualitative methodologies and designing impact evaluations under conditions of complexity. So I thought what we are actually talking about here is essentially like 4 key themes around not just combining different methods, but also like blurring, more generally, like blurring methodological boundaries to design bespoke impact evaluation. And particularly, this comes with a certain level of risk. So what happens when we don't follow like a sort of well-defined, well-established protocol and apply one single method? So there are certain risks connected to uncertainty, ambiguity, something that has potentially never done before in that kind of specific combination. So how do we ensure quality? I also want to say that in evaluation, the end goal, I would say, of the evaluation is not exclusively quality in the same way that sometimes is for research. I mean, I guess it's not an absolute for research as well, but yeah, it's a different degree. I will not mention use much, but I will, I guess, talk about different dimensions of quality, just sort of including the discussion, the awareness that, quality is a multidimensional concept. Other than this, I will essentially address the ambiguity and uncertainty around designing impact relation around 4 key themes. So one is the selection of appropriate methodological options, or in other words, like sort of moving away from accepting the, I would say, prevalence. I use this word like methodological supremacy, which is quite strong, of single options to a sort of more pragmatic, more open comparison and eventually selection among different options. And this creates uncertainty in the sense that it's not always clear. Actually, usually it's often not clear which option is optimal. So in a way, the optimal choice is not something static, but it changes depending on a number of factors. So the optimal choice is conjunctural in a way. So that's kind of the first key theme. The other sort of dimension of uncertainty is around co-designing social research or evaluation, for example, engaging stakeholders. So in this case, the ambiguity is around subject and object of the study, where the boundary lies. The third key theme is about, so once we have selected single options, let's say following a most appropriate logic, then how do we combine options? And here, this is perhaps, something which has a long-standing tradition. I'm sure many of you have heard about mixed methods or mixed designs. And here, the sort of source of complexity / confusion is reconciling differences within the same designs. And finally, one, I guess, something around which there's a lot of interest and this is interested in increasing recently, is the so-called hybrid methodologies. So by hybrid, I mean methodologies that are inherently both qualitative and quantitative. So there are both qualitative and quantitative aspect in the sort of core design of the method. So it's not a mix, it's not a combinations. It's a kind of method or approach that reconciles sort of 2 cultures, if you want, methodological culture in the same designs, like, for example, QCA and process tracing. So I'm just going to follow like these 4 broad themes. I will try and make a brief introduction around sort of some concepts that are going to be useful, I guess, throughout. So one is the multidimensionality of quality. And the other one is essentially what do I mean when I say approach, method, technique, design, and things like that. So just some sort of clarification around this, and then we start with this sort of 1, 2, 3, 4. As I was saying at the beginning, I will not mention use. I really don't know much about it, but it's important to be aware that the use of evaluation is considered as important and as like sort of more independent and self-standing ideas of evaluation quality. The other issue that you probably notice is that I use the word evaluation a lot. I know that here the term used seems to be like intervention research. So I'm not sure exactly what are how these two terms overlap in the way that they are intended. But yes, I would say my term and the term that I sort of grew up with is evaluation. So policy evaluation and program evaluation. So this is the term that I will mostly use. Right, so just quickly, brief overview of the different evaluation criteria that will come up during the rest of the presentation. I'm just gonna say this like one by one now, and then just a few words on each of them. Framing, transparency, appropriateness, validity, credibility, transferability, robustness, and structure. So very quickly, by framing, I mean the conceptual framing, so the quality of the conceptual theoretical framing underpinning the evaluation. Also, just a note that several of these criteria overlap with more general research criteria, so they're not specific, I guess, to evaluation. Transparency, also known as replicability, confirmability. I know that there are some differences in the literature in the way that these terms are used sometimes, but I'm mostly speaking as a practitioner. So when you apply this notion, sometimes these distinctions are really not relevant. So that's why I'm using like different words to sort of essentially mean the same thing. So appropriateness, we'll have a separate discussion on appropriateness and selecting appropriate options. So I'm just going to sort of go on through validity, by which I mean construct validity or measurement validity, which is the idea of, for example, indicators or measurements of concepts, whether they are well suited to measure what they aim to measure, so independently of other sort of features and properties of these measurements and indicators. Credibility, also known as internal validity, truth value statements, how it's around how much can the findings be trusted, to what extent can we be confident that the findings are plausible. And this is interesting because especially in evaluation, there's a recent debate around the credibility of causal statements and how causal statements, what are the properties that of causal statements that need to hold for causal statements to be credible. So there's a lot to say about this. We'll talk about this, I think, towards the end, especially when we mention process tracing. Then transferability, also known as external validity, around whether, how, and to what extent findings can be transferred to other groups, contexts, or sectors. Finally, robustness, also known as reliability, dependability, consistency, and stability. This is, I think that there's a word that in evaluation has become quite popular in the recent, I think about a decade now, if not almost a decade and a half, which is like methodological rigor and robustness. And I think it's technically not a quality criteria because it's largely undefined in the community, but I think this is the sort of quality criteria that it's closest to the way rigor is used. And it's about whether findings are likely to be sensitive or changeable depending on various features of the research process, like the analytical techniques used or specific researcher collecting, analyzing, interpreting data. Finally, structure is essentially how the findings are communicated more broadly. but also like special characteristics of research reports and things like that. So one of these criteria is methodological appropriateness. So we are discussing this in more detail after I clarify a little bit more what I mean by method, approach, design, and technique. I am not basing this on a thorough review of the literature or anything. It's just like the way that essentially over the years in various communities I've seen this terms used. So I'm not saying that this is how they should be used, but also just sort of be clear on what I mean when I use these terms in this talk. So by approach/design, I mean sort of the plan, I would say, for the research plan in a way that is like linked to the research question. So it's a bit like, how do I answer the research question? And the first level of answer at the sort of highest level of abstraction is the approach/design, and I use the two terms interchangeably. For example, QCA, process tracing in general, realist evaluation, contribution analysis will be a design or an approach, while method is something a bit more specific. So it's more like a step-by-step guide on how to implement the approach. So for example, realist evaluation, do we mean within case realist evaluation or apply to a small number of cases, or do we mean realist synthesis on a sort of larger number of cases? Which specific version of QCA are we using? Which specific variant of process tracing are we using? But also it's used, I think, in terms of broad approach to data collection analysis. For example, are we doing interviews or surveys, without going into further detail? While technique is like more detailed data collection analysis procedure, like type of interview or focus groups, like for example, the degree of structure, type of survey, online, in person, things like that. So thanks for bearing with me through all this introduction. So now I'm starting to address these issues of ambiguity and uncertainty by 4 different angles. So the first is comparing and selecting appropriate methodologies. So how do we select methodologies? How do we say, well, we have a number of options, which option is best? So historically, this was a bit an ideological issue. So methodological choice was almost, so different methods were considered like incomparable, almost like incommensurable. So inherently sort of tied to individual preference. And it's interesting that also individually usually had stable preferences. So there was no change across project sectors. So that's like this expert is an expert of this method and they always use the same method. So whatever they do. And there was also the idea that methodological choice is grounded on worldview. And I think we are transitioning from this kind of situation to a situation where the choice of the best methodology or which methodology to use is pragmatic, it's open, and it's based on the idea that methodological options are comparable. So options can have different strengths and weaknesses. There is no single option that is best all the time. So the optimality of the choice is conjunctural. So it depends on a number of characteristics of the evaluation process, of the program, and so on. And how do we ensure that this process is high quality? We do it by explaining why the option is in that particular context best positioned to meet certain criteria. So I'll just give you an example from Stern et al., the design triangle. We have a number of options, and then we are constrained by program attributes. And we also have preferences in terms of evaluation questions. And then the optimal choice must align like with all the, where we sit like across these 3 dimensions, for example. But in general, you can also sort of take a step back and think, well, you know, how methodological choice is a choice. So, you know, what are the theories around how human choice works? So what are the factors affecting human choice? And this is just, I'm sure there are many different theories. This is just one from analytical sociology. And the idea is that choices are affected by a combination of preferences, opportunities, and beliefs, which can create possible tensions in, for example, where preferences contrast with opportunities, things like that. So if that's the case, then the available designs are opportunities, the program attributes are constraints, which are a bit like negative opportunities, and the evaluation questions are parts of the preferences. But we can update this triangle thinking that actually our preferences are not just about questions. So we don't do evaluations only, merely, exclusively to answer evaluation questions. We can also have other goals related to evaluation processes, ownership. I will have a slide about this later. So in that case, our preferences extend to something else that methods potentially offer that goes beyond the ability to answer specific questions. And because methods have requirements, so they need to sort of fit with a specific evaluation process with given resources and possibilities. And this is not always possible. So a classic example is randomized controlled trials. They're not always like feasible, but there are many others. So, so one way of seeing this choice is thinking about it in terms of preferences, so evaluation questions, but also achieving other evaluation goals, and requirements or constraints, whether the evaluation process and resources is able to meet the specific methodological requirements, or how feasible and applicable the design is within a certain projects. And seeing appropriate choice in this way sort of contrasts with the idea of there being a generic gold standard and there being like one choice that is always best under all circumstances. So sometimes in evaluation circles, you hear that we didn't do RCTs because we couldn't, you know, but then that was the first option. So, and this is a bit moving away from the idea that it's not just about feasibility, but also about desirability. So it's like, are all the options always desirable? Yeah, things like that. And then here I have some slides, but this is something that we can discuss in the Q&A. So I'm not, it's basically about a tool called Choosing Appropriate Evaluation Methods tool, but they're actually designs the way I've kind of defined them today. So it's essentially includes like a list of options, a list of evaluation questions which are compatible with different definitions of impact evaluation, and then a list of potential goals that can be achieved by evaluations. I'm not going through all this information, just kind of skimming through. I guess there's also what methods require to allow the user to understand whether options are feasible. So this is kind of the final result of sort of returned by the tool when you use it and input the information required. So just want to give you an idea of like 3 possible different situations that can arise. So the 3 lines that you see are related to the appropriateness of different methods. So the columns are methodological options, okay? So, and the rows are the ability of the different methods to answer specific questions, the ability to achieve other goals of the evaluation, and whether they are feasible, the sort of some kind of measure of feasibility. And all of this calculated on the basis of information input by the user. So you see that in the first case, you would really like to, you just kind of, your preferences around net effect questions, questions around how much of a difference did the intervention make. So you would really like to use experimental methods, counterfactual-based methods, because that's the kind of questions that they are really fit to answer, but they are not feasible. So this is in a way, typical gold standard influence situations. I would like to use this method, but I can't. So in the second image, in the bottom, there's a change in preferences. So nothing much changes in terms of feasibility, but now my preferences actually align with what I can do. So there's an alignment between preferences and opportunities, no dissonance there. And finally, here it's a situation where all different quasi-experiments, including randomized control trials, are feasible, but I'm just not interested in the kind of questions that they can answer, and not even like other potential goals that they can reach. So on this theme, just to recap, so it's important to clarify the choice, because it's a choice that can change depending on the conditions, the evaluation process. So in a way, it's optimal, but conjuncturally, not absolutely, not in an absolute sense. And then clarity is needed on the comparative advantages and limitation of different options. So if there's clarity on this, explanation provided, I guess that, in terms of quality, we're not doing badly. Right, so the second point is achieving other evaluation goals, which is actually part of the preferences. So, for example, one reason, or at least one component of evaluation processes that some clients are very keen on focusing on is the engaging stakeholders. So some commissioners actively seek to engage stakeholders in an attempt to foster ownership of the evaluation processes, and they consider these like goals in themselves, independently of the methods used. Sometimes it's about like rebalancing power dynamics in the way that a process has been governed up until that point, and things like that. So I guess in such cases, the evaluator also needs to include facilitation elements and allow the stakeholders to some extent co-design the evaluation and provide input. Obviously, the uncertainty here is who is setting the term, who is drawing the boundaries, who is the object and subject. So it's not always easy. And there's like a debate around how do we ensure quality? How do we sort of retain? There's also they use words like objectivity, even though it's certainly a very strong term. So I guess, in my experience, and I always speak from an experience perspective, what's important here to ensure quality is clarifying for sort of when you present information, clarifying what the source of the different types of inputs and information is, and explaining why the particular source was considered credible, actually the most credible one for a specific type of information. So for example, this, if social workers are involved, it's unlikely that they're going to be asked to, I don't know, assess the design from a philosophy of science perspective, but it's very likely that they're going to be the experts of the situation on, for example, the characteristics of the service users. So this is, I guess, a tidbit from an evaluation that I actually mentioned in the other, in some sort of future slides, that we actually did. We basically involved them in the design, and I would say something that happens. I mean, you probably know this better than I do. Some social workers are highly invested in their work, so this word is used like care, social care, and that's because they care. And there are sensitivities, there are stakes. So it's also like a risk not to involve them, in the sense that it could be potentially difficult to obtain their willingness to cooperate and obtain their trust. If they don't understand the evaluation aims, if they don't understand what it's for, and if their input and knowledge is not valued in the process. So, for example, very recently, the protocol, the QIE protocol, Qualitative Impact Evaluation Protocol, has been co-designed essentially with them. So they have been able to advise on some of the key elements of it. Right, so the third theme is combining appropriate options. I would say this element of combination, because the first one was about selecting, let's say, the most appropriate, even just one, and the criteria to do so. This is about combining different options independently of how they've been selected, but including, when they've been selected in an appropriate way. And this, in a way, it's like a more long-standing practice. Sure, you've heard of mixed methods. It's interesting that historically, this mostly meant like using both surveys and case studies in the same design. So it was a bit like it's mixed method if there's a bit of qualitative data, a little bit of quantitative data, then it's mixed design. Now that we are in this context of expansion of options, like even within qualitative designs, it can mean so many different things. It could also mean like combining different design options, even in the sort of qualitative group. So combining different case-based methodologies. And also when you use, like, for example, when you use that tool, you are given a ranking of the most appropriate methods. And sometimes this ranking is linked to the fact that you're interested in maybe two different evaluation questions, and you have like one option that is best suited for one, another option that is best suited for the other. So you have to combine them in the same design. I have an example here, which is actually particularly interesting because it's been challenging in a way. I would say complex, but also like it's a sort of interesting complexity, if you want. So this is the evaluation of the so-called Amber Foundation program. I don't know if some of you are familiar with this foundation. It's essentially a program of activities organized to support temporary homeless youth, organizing for residencies, and the sort of welcome youth that has become temporarily homeless and help them prepare for handling future challenges related, for example, to housing and the job market and things like that. And so the terms of reference for this qualitative impact evaluation showed where it was very like clear in terms of preferences. So what were the evaluation questions they were interested in? What were the evaluation goals? And it seems like on this base, like it was like lots of different preferences. So it was difficult to understand what were the priorities, you know? So it seems like potentially it could include like 4 different options. So combining like 4 different options, which could potentially be self-standing. So it's quite complex. I mean, usually in my other sort of experiences, I combine 2, maybe. I can't remember a situation where it was 3, but like never 4. And it's interesting that, so maybe I'll tell you a little bit more about these cases. So the sort of journeys of these residents seems quite unique so far. So they have a really wide range of needs and backgrounds. And there's also a wide range of what stakeholders seems to consider a good outcome. And so what are we doing? Like essentially we are sort of designing a kind of unique designing a design. It's not a good way of saying things, but like the design is quite unique in the sense that it includes principles of contribution analysis. For example, we include factors related to the program, but also unrelated to the program, intermediate outcomes, together with like ultimate outcomes. There are principles of relative evaluation in the way that we are trying to sort of explain the outcomes and sort of design the pathways, formulate the pathways leading to the outcomes. So we are thinking of this in terms of like contextual conditions that make the program work, for whom, under what circumstances, you know, and trying to understand why is this triggered, why is this mechanism triggered, all in some context. Then we're considering process tracing as well, because in the TOR, they mention confidence level, strong evidence of journey. So it's like, well, you know, that's the method to do that. You know, that's the method that allows you to do that. So, you know, at this time, it doesn't seem like extremely likely that we'll find this evidence consistently across the cases, but we are aiming for at least a few. Finally, QCA. So in the TOR, they use language of necessity and sufficiency, systematic case comparison, factors that facilitated the achievement of the outcome. So it's like, well, it sounds like we have to at least consider QCA. And then seems like we'll have a chance to compare about 100 residents. So even though the cases are quite unique, it's not unlikely that at least some like similarities might emerge, maybe on a small number of conditions, or on like subgroups of residents. I mean, there's a lot of data to work with. So yeah, it doesn't seem unlikely that patterns will emerge. Yeah, so I mean, here I was just explaining basically that we are combining relative evaluation and contribution analysis in the way that we build the explanations, but there are other examples of other typical combinations, like, for example, QCA process tracing. QCA and relative evaluation is a bit of a classic. And then Bayesian updating potentially can be sort of combined with many different ways of representing the theory, like even agent-based modeling. And here I have a nice chart to confuse you. I'm not explaining this. Anyway, right. So how much time do I have left? 10 minutes. Okay, cool. So now we have arrived to the 4th theme, which is hybrid methodologies, like QCA and process tracing. And initially I was asked to sort of talk about one example of application, but then I thought it's going to be hard to sort of pick one, because every time you test these methods on a different program, different context, different sector, different type of evaluation process, like you learn something new. So it's difficult to just like convey in a way most of the learning in one example. So apologies if this is too abstract, but we can definitely in the Q&A, I mean, feel free to ask me questions about additional examples and things like that. So, right, so what are hybrid methodologies? So I call hybrid methodologies that are inherently like both qualitative and quantitative. And in particular, like both QCA and especially formalized Bayesian process tracing, they both test explanations of outcomes, so qualitative explanations of outcomes, so qualitative causal statements. But at the same time, both are grounded on branches of mathematics. And this is not, typical bedfellows, I would say. It's something that creates confusion in most users and adds a degree of complexity. It's just something that people are not used to deal with, like in the same design. Specifically, like for QCA, there's like qualitative constructs are conceptualized as sets. So it's qualitative, but at the same time, it's based on set theory. It's a branch of mathematical logic. And then for process tracing, again, the focus is on causal mechanisms, which are even more fine-grained than in QCA. But then Bayesian probability theory is essentially calculus. Right. So how do we ensure quality? I would say like ensuring quality here is easier because like there's a lot that you can check at each single application step. So we'll talk about the application steps as well. So maybe actually we can skip this. This is just like some basic notions. I'm sure many of you will already know about this. You know how QCA is like specifically suited to handle causal necessity and causal sufficiency, but also Innes causes and Sewing causes, which are causes which are neither necessary nor sufficient, but at the same time, they're very relevant in evaluation. So again, we can talk about this in the Q&A if you're interested. In terms of like research evaluation questions, like one way to sort of describe a typical research evaluation questions in QCA is like which conditions are necessary and which conditions are sufficient for an outcome, but also which conjunctions or disjunction of conditions, because it uses the set operations, conjunction, disjunction, and negation. I also have a slide, which again, we can discuss later in the Q&A if you're interested, on the differences with regression analysis, because one additional element of confusion, if you want, is that the QCA model looks like not completely different from a regression model in that you have a set of factors and an outcome. So when you first come across this, you're like, one of the things that you first ask yourself is like, okay, but then what's the difference with regression analysis? And it's like it's a very substantial difference. But yes, we can go into more details about this later. Just a recap of different variants of QCA, which I kind of linked to the way I used methods rather than approach, number of different procedures, ways that you can analyze the data set. So what are the application steps? I was saying that each application step comes with its own ways to quality assure it, but also with its own opportunities and challenges. So I would say the process is more or less divided into sort of this sequence, but at the same time, it's an iterative sequence, so you can sort of go back and redo it, and there can be like a number of different rounds. So the first is to sort of identify the model, outcomes to explain, and this is one of the first challenges, like when you have like too many outcomes, which is not a good situation because it means that you have to do the same analysis. You have to repeat the same analysis for every outcome. And, sometimes this clashes with like budget and resource constraints. And then identify a set of relevant causal factors and conditions, which are plausible explanations for the outcome. And then there's an issue of like, which conditions do we select? Because they cannot be like 250 conditions, like in some econometric models with 250 variables. So there's a number of considerations to make on how conditions are selected, which again, we can discuss in the Q&A. Then perhaps the most time-consuming phase is calibration of conditions, especially when it's done in a sort of bottom-up way, like carefully comparing how each case stacks up against one another across different factors. And then data collection, once conditions are calibrated, data collection, creation of the data set, Boolean data set or fuzzy data set, and then analysis of data set and interpretation of the results. And this is kind of the, and then as for the analysis, I've already mentioned that there are different types of analysis, each with like slightly different information provided, essentially. So where is the hybridity in QCA? I would say it's in calibration, because it's a situation where you have a qualitative construct and you need to sort of convert it to a binary value or a fuzzy value. But even if the value is fuzzy, it's like one option out of 4, one option out of 6 at most. Then another issue is what do the findings look like? Sometimes you have to sort of give an example, like, because it's something that many have never seen. So, and the findings are essentially something that is a qualitative explanation at the same time, or at least a list of important ingredients of a qualitative explanation. But at the same time, it's an expression of Boolean algebra. So if you look at like, oh, is this what the case study is? Like, because on one hand, it's like, oh, but case studies are conceptualized as wholes. You know, we're not dividing them up into variables. So we are using a holistic approach to case study analysis, but then it's actually a binary sequence of zeros and ones. So yeah, and you know, all of these things make sense at the same time. So it's not like immediately intuitive to understand what's going on. So just give you a bit of an example of how an early data set looked like. You see there's like a lot of missing values here, but just, yeah, I just took this one from one of the latest projects. And in this case, the factors are grouped into 4 categories. It's a hybrid approach, actually. It's a combination with between relative evaluation and QCA. So there's like context conditions, 2 types of context conditions, background and program context, mechanism conditions, and outcome. So to conclude on QCA, like, what are the advantages and limitations? I would say that in terms of advantages, it is unique in many ways. It is, I think, at least some time ago, it was described as the best of both worlds, because it brought together like the benefits and advantages of qualitative methods and quantitative methods at the same time. So it is kind of weird combinations of things, but yeah, that, you know, there's a way of seeing it is that it does bring out the best of 2 different cultures in a way. It is certainly unique in the way it uses set theory in social research, in the way it handles causal necessity and sufficiency, including I-ness and SUIN causes. And this is very relevant to evaluations, because interventions often overlap. They're never implemented in some kind of like void or like lab conditions. They are implemented in a historical context, essentially, in a social context. And also, it's quite unique, I think, for case-based generalization, because I struggle to think of any other ways of generalizing findings across a large number of cases, preserving qualitative information about the single cases. So, and this generalization is not, for example, you know, across 1,000. I mean, usually it's not across thousands and thousands and thousands of cases, but it's still like quite it's still quite substantial. Like I think it can handle like I think a few hundreds of cases. Like I haven't checked the latest developments, but it's definitely no longer small n anymore. Definitely medium n. So yes, and then it's also quite flexible, so it can be applied to all sorts of different theories and explanations. Now, what are the limitations? Well, if you haven't like gathered the limitations so far and the challenges, it can be highly technical, and it also requires like in-depth case knowledge, it's difficult to have both of these skills in the same person. So usually the principal investigator will be a qualitative researcher with substantive expertise. So if these kind of highly technical skills are not in the same person, then there needs to be like close collaboration, you know, within the team, a team of like different skills. So, you know, in many cases this is possible, but it's something that cannot be taken for granted. Okay, so I think I'm done with QCA, process tracing next. So, okay, the way I have a number of like slides on the sort of basic notions around process tracing, which again, I'm not sure how much of this is new for you or not. So I'll just kind of try and quickly like skim through them. I guess this is adapted from Andrew Bennett, and it's essentially the three building block of process tracing, which are the sort of the ontological entity, which could be the theory, for example, or the explanation, and then the empirical observation. And then there's a human confidence that the theory or the explanation is true or plausible on the basis of empirical observation. And confidence is a human belief, so it's held at the cognitive level. It's basically a thought in our head. So this is just to sort of lay down the basics. You might have heard of different metaphors to categorize evidence in process tracing. And the metaphors essentially constitute assessments of the strength of evidence, but also the direction of evidence. So they essentially say, this is strong confirmatory evidence of the theory. This is strong weakening evidence of the theory. So on this basis, we rule out the theory. Some tests can both be sort of confirmatory or disconfirmatory, depending on whether the evidence is observed or not. So they're always useful, whether you observe the evidence or not. Others are not. So some are all useful if the evidence is observed or if the evidence is not observed. Others are never really useful. They're sort of relatively weak, just throwing the wind. So I'm just going through this like quickly, but again, this is something that we can pick up in the Q&A. And this is the sort of clarity matrix that links, clarity matrix and components of the base formula. What does this have to do with process tracing? Well, the issue is that sorry, I think I moved slides. So the issue is that essentially the Bayesian formalization allows us to understand what kind of test we're working with by estimating the probabilities that are embedded in the Bayes formula, which are essentially related to conditional assumptions on whether the claim is true or not. So if the claim is true, how likely is the evidence? And if the evidence is highly likely, then we have a hoop test. If the evidence is unlikely, and the claim is true, it's something that it's misleading, we don't use it. But another highly valued test is like something that is highly unlikely to be observed if the claim is false. So that would be a smoking gun. There's a lot to say about this, and it's quite technical. So, but there is a link between like the Bayesian formalization and the way that these tests are identified, which is quite traceable. And rather than providing a simple argument, like a narrative argument as to why like something is a smoking gun or a hoop test, something is like conclusive for confirming the theory or for rejecting theory. You just go through a formalized process of assessing probabilities of events on the basis of whether the theory is true or not. And then it's just a little bit more robust, I guess. So this is basically what the method does. Now, in terms of application steps, practical application steps, the first one, again, you know, this is a sequence, but it's iterative. Claim selection. So selecting a claim to test, this comes with potential challenges because sometimes you work with stakeholders which take ages to focus on a small number of claims. And then once you have the claims, you identify the empirical implications of the claim being true or false. In other words, you identify the evidence test on the basis of expectations of what will be observed, with what probability, if the claim is true or false. And the goal is to identify like highly likely events or highly unlikely events under the assumptions that the claim is true or false. Specifically, highly likely events if the claim is true, and highly unlikely events if the claim is not true. This is not always possible. So there are some claims that are difficult to test in this way, difficult to associate with like conclusive tests. But if we do, then we can use the Bayes formula to update our confidence in the theory. And so what this means is that we can formally measure the strength of evidence. We can compare strength of evidence for different claims. We can compare like how much different pieces of evidence support a single claim and others. And we can also formally like update our own confidence, which is subjective technically, but you can also start from a neutral stance. So 0.5 is neutrality. So technically it is subjective, but it's also unbiased because it's like, I have no idea if this is true or not, and sort of allow the updating process to speak. So your posterior will be based only on the empirical observations. This we can get back to these charts and things like that later. So practical aspects of this method of applying this methodology in the real world. As I was saying, the claim selection can be time-consuming, and the claims are often co-selected with stakeholders because, as an evaluator, it's hard for you to say what are the relevant claims. It's just that's sort of a relatively arbitrary choice that it's important to sort of make with those who have a stake in the process. Then if you go with the formal version of the method, you have to estimate the probabilities, which is akin to sort of elicit expert opinion. Can be done a number of ways: group-based approaches, individual-based approaches, in between. There's a method that has been developed at the University of Sheffield, very interesting. It's called the Shelf method. I would say in practice, it's quite time-consuming to apply the method, and depending on, I would say from my perspective, it is accepted that these estimations are done within the evaluation team, including the stakeholders, so without recurring to sort of additional formalities. Because what matters, and this kind of appear like potentially, I don't know, sort of confusing or biased, but at the same time, what matters with this method, in my view, is the transparency. So you make the process transparent, anyone can challenge your estimates, anyone can come up with different estimates. So there's like it's important that the sensitivity analysis is possible. And more often than not, you will discover that actually, even if you change the estimate substantially, the overall judgment on the strength of evidence and the confidence doesn't change that much. So it's kind of reassuring in a way, even if the process is not like super rigorous or as rigorous as it could possibly be. If you do the sensitivity analysis, you realize that sort of you're onto something anyway. And then the other issue to consider is also like quite technical, like combining piece of evidence, understanding stochastic independence. But I would say perhaps the user-friendly thing is that you don't need to sort of use numbers necessarily. So you can use qualitative descriptors of probability with stakeholders. This is just an example of a scale. There can be other scales. I can argue why I think in this case, this scale sort of makes sense. This is the representation of the scale visually. Again, we can pick this up in the Q&A if you're interested. So to sort of almost finalize, where is the hybridity? Well, it's hybrid because you're testing a qualitative claim explicitly using probability theory. So it's a bit like you have a qualitative statement, but you're using a mathematical formula to sort of test it. And there are ways to make the process user-friendly and participatory, but at the end, there's always the update between the prior and the posterior. So the formula more or less explicitly is there. I have an example here, but again, if it's late, we can pick this up in the Q&A. So to sort of conclude, advantages for me, especially the formalization, adds transparency to the process, traceability even, because you estimate confidence during a process that can be replicated. There's transparency on how the root probabilities have been estimated, and this opens up the findings to scrutiny, challenge, but at the same time builds credibility because everyone can see what you did and how you got to the findings. And the credibility is also more like in an internal validity sense because you can test causal propositions as well. So propositions are formally causal. And then reliability, if you sort of repeat the process, end up confirming the findings, sensitivity analysis, and that kind of thing. What are the downsides, limitations? There's definitely a learning curve. As I was saying, the selection of specific claims, it's both highly needed because you can't apply the same method to a high number of claims. There's a high level of detail that's required. I mean, the workload gets easily like unmanageable if you start doing this on a high number of claims. But yeah, sometimes the selection itself is time consuming. So the idea is to sort of do this in a sort of limited number of cases where it's most needed, essentially. Okay, I'm done. Thank you very much.